Okay, so today I want to talk a fair bit about conscience, which obviously has come up this morning, and then I want to talk about a very particular area of reproductive ethics known as reproductive pressure or coercion. But first of all, I'd like to sort of say some general things about conscience and moral philosophy more generally. Well, an economist friend of mine used to begin his talks by saying that his favourite religious feast day was the Feast of the Assumption. And what's true of economists is even more true of philosophers. So I'm going to begin with a number of assumptions, though not, I hope, fatally controversial ones. I'm assuming that moral judgments can be true or false, and consequently that judgments of conscience can be right or wrong. I take that to be a commonsensical assumption, and I agree with David Wiggins's wise words about moral philosophy generally, that we should never forget the things we already know about our subject matter. For in the matters we are concerned with, philosophy itself will lack all authority from the outset unless it pays eager attention to that which is always present on the surface or some way below the surface in the ordinary thoughts and ideas of ordinary, passably good, passably sensible people, and present there entirely independently of the ministrations of philosophy. By conscience, I mean a kind of moral awareness and self-criticism, what Aurel Colnay describes as remorse, warning, acquittal, or approbation in reference to one's own conduct, past, present, or tentatively planned. Conscience means further moral judgments in the shaping of one's conduct, not only to represent my general knowledge of right and wrong on the one hand, and to prod me to do right and to shun wrong on the other, but to tell me what is right or wrong here and now, and thus to inform the morality of my actual conduct. Historically, conscience was seen, in the literature and philosophy of ancient Greece, for example, as a knowledge of faults, or lack of fault, before developing into a perception of what would, in the future, put one at fault. Later, St. Paul famously connects conscience with a more general law in our hearts of right and wrong. But this law is not, for him, identical with conscience, but something which conscience draws on in accusing or excusing one's self. Now, I'm taking it that conscience isn't simply some amplified form of egoism, where we put on a pained expression, assure everyone we wrestle with this thing called conscience, and then do as we damn well please. This reminds me of the wit who once said of a pious and opportunistic US politician, he always publicly wrestles with his conscience, and he always wins. Well, one kind of mistake people are liable to make with regard to conscience is to make it the ultimate test of morality, with no standard above it. And this view certainly has some plausibility if we focus on the, I would say, correct intuition that nothing can be more obviously moral than to intend to do the right thing, and nothing more obviously immoral than to intend to do something you perceive to be wrong. However, it is absolutely wrong to assume that the most obviously morally good or bad feature of an action, i.e. good faith, exhaustively defines its goodness or badness. There is much more to good actions than having a good conscience. Conscience is aiming, at least, to connect with moral reality, and will sometimes aim unsuccessfully. Why should I obey my conscience, or at least not disobey it? One cannot coherently say of anything that one believes it, but it is false. And similarly, the agent cannot possibly know that his conscience is wrong at the moment his conscience delivers a judgment. So even allowing for the possibility of erroneous conscience, one surely cannot be said to be committing a morally good act if one is acting against one's very own moral judgment that the act should not be done. this will simply not be the same moral act, understood in a holistic sense, as an act of someone who makes a similar choice, but in good faith. Regardless of the moral permissibility of the choice in general, a bad faith decision cannot be a morally good one if we understand acting against conscience as necessarily wrong, even if acting in accordance with conscience is not enough to make our action right. To act wrongly, it is enough that our action is wrong in one respect, even if the same external behaviour, differently motivated or conceptualised morally, would have been morally justified. Well, those who want to dismiss the relevance of conscience may try and say that all that matters is whether the act is objectively good or bad. But that leaves out of account the powerful intuition that acting against our own best lights is fundamentally morally wrong, even if other aspects of the act turn out to possess some value which we hadn't yet realised. In particular, moral theories which minimise or obliterate the moral importance of the good or bad faith of actions and all our intended ends and means, focusing instead exclusively on consequences, are not, I take it, paying attention to ordinary moral experience and have well-documented problems of their own. Conscience, even erroneous conscience, should be respected, not because we regard conscience as an inscrutable supreme principle of morality, but rather, to return to Colnay, because conscience, however erroneous we may reasonably deem it by reference to a specified province of morality, expresses and presupposes the agent's general response, assent, and submission to the valid intrinsic principles of morality as we know them. I may feel remorse that in a complex and morally charged situation I did not listen to my voice of conscience. But the voice I didn't listen to is not just about itself, but about moral qualities I discerned in the situation but ignored. Finally, I want to suggest that there is a very particular kind of harm that can result when we disobey our conscience, including under pressure from others, namely moral regret. Plausibly, the integration of our moral and emotional lives is the reason that an emotion like regret can significantly harm our well-being. Living in regret is to be avoided. It is often rational to avoid emotional harms like regret, especially strict moral regret, for the action itself as opposed to its consequences. After all, bad conscience at the time of decision is often an aspect of strict moral regret, whether such regret is otherwise justified or not. One can avoid living in strict moral regret if one does what one concludes to be the right thing, or at least, if one is unsure, something above moral reproof. Trying to avoid moral regret as best one can is a reasonable way to live one's life, even if moral regret cannot be avoided altogether, not least because our conscience can be mistaken. Moral reasons of a certain kind, i.e. those not involving supererogation, are reasons one is not free to beg off from, so to speak, in the way which we might beg off from non-moral reasons. Moral reasons of this kind are precisely those reasons that are, or should be, conclusive, and our experience of moral regret seems to gel well with this understanding. It is no accident, I think, that some of the most powerful and paradigmatic depictions of regret in the arts are of the pangs of conscience. Think of Lady Macbeth, unable to live with the moral stain which she previously thought, or tried to think, was but a small matter which could be washed away with a little water. And of course, Macbeth himself, though initially more reluctant to commit his crime, is radically more damaged by the blunting of conscience, although he is less remorseful. Well, one final assumption before we come to reproductive coercion. I take it that a paradigmatically moral kind of experience is what we feel when faced with the prospect of violating a strong negative moral prohibition. I'm not saying that this is all of morality. Clearly it isn't, and can't be, as we also have positive moral obligations. But I am saying there is a very distinctive and focused kind of moral experience which concerns various negative prohibitions. I offer no proof for this assumption, but simply invite listeners to ask yourselves whether this aligns with your own moral experience. Well, bearing these considerations about conscience and the nature of morality in mind, I would now like to talk about an area of reproductive ethics that has lately garnered some attention. Well, what do I mean by reproductive pressure or coercion? Well, the term is generally held to mean attempting control or influence over the contraceptive and/or pregnancy choices and outcomes of another. Note, we are focused here not, as we've just been hearing, on legislative or even societal pressures, but more on pressures exerted typically by one partner over another. This is perhaps not surprising or even necessarily objectionable. After all, just as couples may argue over what country they want to live in, they may also argue over something else that affects them both profoundly: whether and when to have children. In the words of my colleague Greg Pike, a simple commitment to always respect reproductive autonomy and avoid any kinds of pressure fails to appreciate the complexities of relationships. It also fails to assist couples to negotiate the complex territory of reproduction and identify better as opposed to worse choices and outcomes in both the short and the long term. More generally, pressure or coercion to avoid harm or perceived harm is not the same as pressure or coercion to promote harm in the reproductive as in any other domain. That said, some kinds of pressure or coercion certainly are morally objectionable and must be strongly opposed. Well, common forms of reproductive pressure or coercion include birth control sabotage, pregnancy pressure, and pregnancy coercion. However, one area of reproductive pressure and coercion which has received relatively little attention in the literature, questions about it sometimes being left out of studies, is pressure on women to terminate a pregnancy. I'm focusing on this area, firstly because it is neglected, and secondly because it involves a very well recognised area of moral debate where there can be powerful conflicts between partners. Note, I'm not taking a position here on the moral rightness or wrongness of abortion, but am more concerned with the kinds of beliefs that people have which may influence their decisions. The moral debate over abortion is primarily determined by metaphysical and moral questions concerning the nature and status of the fetus, as well as questions about bodily respect. Well, let us imagine a couple where the woman has become pregnant and wants to continue her pregnancy. Unlike her partner, she believes that she is already a mother and that her partner is already a father. She believes her partner is trying to pressure her into not acting as a good mother to their child, insofar as he is pressuring her to have an abortion. He, on the other hand, may claim that she is coercing him to become a father against his wishes. Both sides here can claim that they are experiencing reproductive pressure or coercion of some kind. However, even allowing for very different perceptions of the status and value of the fetus, and the existence or non-existence of parental roles, usually considered morally very important kinds of roles, it seems as though there are significant asymmetries here. To begin with, what the male partner is urging involves a bodily intervention on the woman herself as well as the fetus. Moreover, It is an intervention that most thoughtful people do not consider women have a duty to submit to, even if they think they have a right to this intervention. Finally, the cost if the woman is correct about the ethics of the situation and the man is wrong is surely higher. So even if she is uncertain of her position, she may reasonably say that given her moral uncertainty, she would prefer not to take the risk. After all, if she is right and he is wrong, the life of an actual child will be at stake. And whether or not this is really the case, if she succumbs, she will do something of a kind to produce in her the paradigmatic moral experience of guilt at the violation of a powerful negative prohibition. In contrast, if he is right and she is wrong, but gets her way and continues the pregnancy, a child will be born. Instead of there being an abortion which might have solved some problems and relieved the partner of the burdens of unwanted parenthood. That seems to lack the moral charge of what the woman is risking if she has the abortion. Arguably, her partner's concerns are much more what we might call prudential considerations, rather than anything of comparable moral weight. Of course, he may claim that her infliction of parenthood on him, as he sees it, is seriously morally wrong. He may also feel morally certain no child is present at this stage, and may point to the enormous lifelong costs to him and perhaps her of her decision to give birth. Not so easy to dismiss, though, is what may be a very predictable reaction of the woman afterwards to the memory of violating what she sees as a powerful negative prohibition. Well, Dan Moller has suggested the following kind of formula concerning moral risk in non-trivial cases like this one. 1. The likelihood that an act A involves wrongdoing. 2. How wrong A would be if it were wrong. 3. The costs the agent faces if she omits A. 4. The agent's level of responsibility for facing the choice of doing A. And 5. Whether not doing A would also involve moral risk. He goes on to suggest that when we're discussing costs to an agent, these costs are clearly relevant to deliberations about risk. But introducing them as countervailing moral risks would be inappropriate, since the costs to the woman don't create obligations or even moral reasons for her to abort. The burdens to the mother generate at best options for abortions, not requirements. So she sees that she has a duty not to do something. There doesn't appear to be an equivalent duty the other way. And as Ted Lockhart has pointed out, the vast majority of agents tacitly accept the proposition that in most situations not having an abortion is morally right or morally neutral and therefore justified all things considered. He continues that almost everyone agrees, except perhaps for special cases like deformed fetuses or serious threats to the lives of pregnant women, it is morally right not to have an abortion. So the woman could argue that her partner's position, if he really thinks she has a duty to have an abortion, is unreasonable. He is certainly an outlier in thinking that she has a moral duty to abort. Moreover, even if she is mistaken in thinking that she has no duty to have an abortion, but rather a duty not to have one, she should not succumb to her partner's pressure if she thinks it is wrong to have an abortion, or even that it may well be. After all, as just mentioned, the moral and other costs of her getting it wrong in succumbing to pressure are high. Her partner should bear this in mind. There is surely a non-negligible possibility of wrongdoing, even if he has decided that the arguments against abortion fail, or at least that abortion is clearly the answer. And whether or not abortion is clearly the answer, if the woman is convinced or suspects that it is not, some deference to her conscience here is surely in order. It is true that on an insensitive form of ethics, such as certain forms of consequentialism focused only on good consequences and not focused so much on the moral inputs of an action, the question of moral cost may look very different. But I take this to be a problem for such theories, which seem to want to revise very basic areas of moral knowledge of the kind I mentioned at the beginning. So taking all of this into account, it looks as though reproductive pressures in these situations is especially wrong. The moral risk involved in urging a morally unwilling woman to abort is significant, regardless of what position one takes on abortion itself. That applies even if the woman is unsure that abortion is wrong but suspects it may be. If the woman succumbs to pressure from her partner, this is likely to leave her morally regretful at violating her conscience. Such regret is moreover reasonable, since violating one's conscience is paradigmatically morally wrong. Well, how common is pressure or coercion to abort? A recent UK ComRes survey of those women experiencing reproductive coercion of this kind, 30% reported pressure to abort, and 15% either physical violence to induce miscarriage or being given an abortion pill without consent. That's from 2022. However, in the words of Greg Pike, despite its earliest inclusion in the definition of reproductive coercion, coercion to terminate a pregnancy has often been lacking in survey instruments. Indeed, it is almost inexplicable that the researchers who first began exploring reproductive coercion have excluded coerced abortion from the survey instrument that has subsequently been used and even more recently refined. Fortunately, others have explored coerced abortion within the overall framework of reproductive coercion, albeit to a limited extent, and such studies reveal prevalence figures showing it is a serious problem that needs attention. Well, much research into reproductive coercion that focuses on pregnancy coercion includes coercion of varying severity, ranging from influence and pressure to threats and violence, and adds that to be able to make a reasonable comparison with pregnancy-promoting behaviour, exploration of coercion to abort must similarly include such variability in severity. So to return to the extent of pressure and coercion on women to abort, a study published last month of a randomly accessed group of women found that 33% described their abortions as wanted, 43% as inconsistent, and by this the study meant inconsistent with their own values and preferences, 14% as unwanted, and 10% as coerced. As the study authors summed it up, only 1 in 3 women described their abortions as both wanted and consistent with their own values and preferences. In contrast, 2/3 experienced their abortion decision as a violation of their own values and preferences, with 24% describing their abortions as unwanted or coerced. The study also found that those who have unwanted abortions are particularly likely to experience detrimental effects on their mental health. Similarly, a 2019 study by Donald Sullins found that 14.7% of abortions were of wanted pregnancies, and that mental health effects like depression and suicide ideation were more likely with these abortions. I hope that such studies will encourage others to investigate further the distressing topic of reproductive coercion in this understudied area, and that people on all sides of the debate will see that there are special kinds of wrongs involved here to which we must all pay closer attention. Recent years have seen increasing focus on what counts as coercion in the sexual arena, and it would be good to see more attention paid to what might count as coercion in cases where a termination of pregnancy is at stake. One reason that pressure to terminate pregnancy is somewhat neglected may be that a common justification for legalised abortion very much centres on the woman's autonomy and right to choose where her body is concerned. This has perhaps led to neglect of concrete situations that many women find themselves in, where autonomy is severely compromised in more or less subtle ways. Just as in sexual ethics, arguably, an overemphasis on sexual freedom led to a lack of attention to the dynamics of sexual relations in a culture promoting a particular kind of autonomy, arguably a very male version, so too in the reproductive area, an overemphasis on autonomy and bodily rights has led people to neglect the fact that very many decisions are not made in ways that are genuinely autonomous, to say nothing of other factors and goods that may be at stake whenever human beings make choices. Well, to conclude, I'll give a concrete illustration of pressures and goods at stake in abortion. I will end with the eloquent words of a post-abortive woman writing on a fetal anomaly parent support website. Her words draw out themes of the maternal role in pregnancy, the well-intentioned urging by others that the woman do what they perceive to be her duty, i.e. abort, considerations of prudence and morality as they see it, and, for the woman, a strong negative moral prohibition as she sees it. Quote, "Almost 9 years ago, after so many years of infertility treatment, my husband and I finally got the news we were expecting, only to find out, after my amnio, that our daughter had a complete trisomy 13. We were told she would not survive until term, that I should terminate my pregnancy. My obstetrician, the geneticist, the perinatologist, my son's paediatrician, everyone I spoke to said I had to terminate my pregnancy, and at 18 weeks it had to be now. I was adamant I could not live with the decision, but my husband had listened to all the advice and agreed that it was for the best and pushed hard for me to terminate. We were told she would not live, that she would suffer unbearably if she made it to term, and I was being selfish to want to keep her, so 2 weeks later I agreed. I understand the medical community looks at these children as lost causes. It is easy to see things in black and white in the world of medicine. But I valued that child, and I was not heard. I was ganged up on, relentlessly pressured, and I was an emotional, hormonal, and physical wreck. And with literally only days to make a choice, it was a nightmare. Medicine says this child will not live long, or may not make it to term. Why should you carry it? I said, because I am a mother. Because I am her mother. But that is not understood. We want perfect. When I called my son's paediatrician, she said to me, "You have to understand, the child you wanted doesn't exist. The child will not live long. Think about what you will do to your family, what that will put them through, how your son will deal with that." What she didn't understand was my son needed a mother who was not an emotional basket case, and terminating the pregnancy sent me right over the edge for a while. Doctors need to know choice means choice, and it is a choice I cannot live with to this day. Thank you.
Any questions? I have a few questions, and then we're going to rush into our lunch.
Thank you very much. My question is a bit more about the beginning. So, the Carol case you described at the end. So if I understood it correctly, you're at least partially trying to weigh, okay, if we get it wrong, how much moral harm will be done.
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to that in principle, but could you explain how that would avoid at least one possible or problematic implication if so there are some people who turn every moral question into a huge issue.
Yep.
This is usually not considered a particular virtuous way of living, but these people really think it is very conscientious about everything.
Yep.
And it seems there's a bit of a risk if we generalize the principle as you described it, at least if I understood it correctly, that these people are going to basically almost always win the argument. Because if they're wrong, there is a huge tragedy.
Yeah.
But that's because they see tragedies everywhere. So how do you, if you use it as a more general principle, how do you avoid the people who are, how do you say, who have more, in this example, realistic views about morality, always losing out to the moral equivalent of a hypochondriac?
Yeah. Well, I've noticed that in social life, those people tend to win whatever we do. So but, I think what I say, and the example I used here, is one where I think, we communally have to decide that certain things are more serious than other things, and for that we rely to some extent on some pretty basic ideas of moral consensus. And the important thing to remember is that there's something very important about respecting the conscience for the kinds of reasons I've suggested. But in a sense, I'm rejecting the idea that the only valuable thing is the conscience. So we don't have to pay, complete deference to that conscience if we really think it's not obviously drawing on some kind of minimally coherent moral universe. So the more that moral belief is outside of any kind of reasonable consensus, the more, the less I think we have to take it so seriously. And it will mean that, yes, as in any society or any set of laws, certain conscientious decisions will be violated, as it were. That's inevitable. But I think trying to assess areas where it looks as though there are very serious things at stake, even where there's a lot of uncertainty. So in the abortion debate, there's a lot of disagreement, there's a lot of uncertainty. But people can understand that there's an idea that there's a great risk, or there might be a moral risk involved, and to impose that kind of risk where there's a very serious outcome if you get it wrong, it seems that conscience should particularly be respected in those kinds of cases. But yes, I don't want to just say the conscience isn't this sort of inscrutable thing that you just think, oh my God, that's someone's conscience, that's great, whatever goes. That conscience is supposed to be aiming towards some kind of moral reality, which, we do try and discover through argument, through observation. And also, as I tried to say at the beginning, I think there is actually, at a certain level, there are some very powerful moral experiences that we all have in relation to, some pretty basic, I think so, killing the innocent, returning evil for good, things like that, I think are actually part of the moral world where we would expect the conscience to be pointing towards correctly. And if it isn't on something relatively trivial, I'm not sure it deserves that enormous level of respect.
I just want to look at, I'm looking at a scenario where the individual conscience or the individual's autonomy is contingent on a kind of like a community or families autonomy as well, where in terms of culture, in terms of certain culture, like for me, I'm from Ghana, so an individual's autonomy is also contingent on the community as well, or the family. So you can't isolate the two, you can't separate it from each other. And you made mention when I think one of the pediatrician of the lady advised that she should also think about the consequence on the family and other people. So how do you separate the two? Since we have to respect the conscience of especially the individual that is involved who has the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we separate the two?
Well,
Do you ignore the family? Do you ignore the community?
Mm-hmm.
Since, I mean, generally, globally, we are all moving towards a kind of community where you kind of like create a community around yourself. Just, we're not an island anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, I'm just trying to, bring the same idea into my context and kind of what
I think when we're thinking about behaving morally, we're thinking about all sorts of things. You're thinking about, the value of this community maybe, or the value of these relations, or all sorts of different values, and they certainly need to be given some kind of weight. I think in the case that I'm sort of focused on, where I become uneasy is if that weight seems to look as though it's going to be outweighing a serious perception of an absolute moral prohibition. Okay, so you think I mustn't do this. This is really fundamentally wrong, or I'm not certain that it's morally wrong, but I think, I know that in my own life I've thought that things were okay, and then it's turned out that later I look at them and they're wrong. It might be one of those situations where it's really serious, if I think that that's wrong. And I think I'm a little bit wary of something where a demand is made upon someone where it looks as though they're going to have to violate, in this case, a negative moral prohibition, where either they think it's absolutely, certainly morally wrong, or it's a serious enough matter for there to be a very a grave moral risk that you don't know for sure it's wrong, but if you get it wrong, there's a much worse outcome one way than another. Okay, and to think that there are sort of the values of a community or value can override that, I would be very, very wary of. There, I think it's possible certain kind of prudential or even non-moral considerations are actually trying to override what looks like a very sort of distinctively moral kind of area, as it were. I.e., I have this very strong perception that this really is morally prohibitive, not just economically stupid or aesthetically unpleasant, but it has a particular moral value. So just as a general rule, I mean, this doesn't, give you a checklist of answering everything, but I think if there's that level of seriousness and there's, some kind of moral consensus that this is at least a serious disputed area, even if there's one disagreement, I'd be wary of having, other values coming in and overriding that, if it's that powerful a case. And bear in mind, there's an asymmetry. It looks as though if you don't do it, okay, maybe you're morally wrong, but the costs don't look quite as high, and they certainly don't look as though they're going to damage you in the way that doing it might, if you've got a reasonable belief that this is maybe seriously morally wrong.
A follow-up. I'm a health professional, and I also look at things in terms of management and resources.
Yep.
If you look at the consequence of not having that abortion,
yep,
where health professionals have given the reality, it's not going to.
Sure.
It's a bad case. Okay?
Yep.
It's going to, if you take it to term, this is what's going to happen.
Yep.
It means that a lot of resources would have to be expended
sure,
to dealing with her, taking care of the child, and all of this. Is it worth it? In terms of resources, as utilitarians would want
sure.
to.
Well, I think, of course, resource questions are important questions, and they obviously come within the purview of morality more generally, I'd say. But I'm quite wary of approaching certain kinds of moral questions from, you might call a sort of bureaucratic mentality. That utilitarianism, for example, is very much favoured by maybe public health officials or certain kind of bureaucracies, partly because you want something to be able to calculate. You want some kind of generic way where we can try and calculate which best resources can go. But I think, as Jan Wilhelm said at the beginning, the danger of that is you're sort of, are you missing out with your calculation, which understandably you have to try and make on some basis. In doing that, are you missing out some extremely important, even more basic values, I'd say, about what this actually might do to a person, to pressure them to go against what they regard as their lights, and in fact they might even say that they don't really see the purpose of their life if they have to violate certain kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, in a sense, I do want to take the individual a bit more seriously, but of course there's a tension, and there's a tension generally, I'd say, with morality and what might be practical in lots of ways. I think there is actually a tension, if by practical you mean something to do generally with human flourishing or health.
Okay, just is there
Actually, a slightly vague question, but one way of hearing is making a request of authorities to and other parties to take seriously the issue of whether or not some person might be right. Mm-hmm. You disagree with them, but what would be the situation if they were right? And there's some plausibility in the thought they'd be right, and that makes a difference to how we should treat them. Mm-hmm. I get the impression that doesn't happen very often. That once a certain view is represented by a legal authority, it is not particularly inclined to allow plausibility or allow for the plausibility or the possibility of rightness of alternative views. When you do get rights of conscience respected, there are very often sociological reasons for that. Yep. So, for example, conscientious objectors in this country in the First World War were allowed for, not, I think, because authority thought they might be right, but because there'd been no history of conscription, and there was a sufficiently inbuilt culture of people not being made to do that sort of thing, that they thought we'd better make some sensible provision for that. Yeah. But it was nothing to do with, you might be right, if you were right, we'd be asking you to do something really terrible. Murder people on state order. Have you any thoughts about that? And is there any way in which one could persuade the legal authority to take epistemology seriously in this area?
It's a bit too early for that. Well, I certainly think, I mean, this isn't really an answer, but I certainly think that there's a real problem in a lot of debates, in fact, that once a certain policy decision is made, there's a tendency to say, this is the reasonable, completely true thing, and then there are these weirdos with their conscientious objections who we just sort of, we allow to do their own thing, so long as it never influences anything ever. And that seems to be troubling all round. I mean, the way I would try and focus it is, I think there are significant harms in pressuring people to go against their consciences on subjects which it is, I think on this one, it is generally agreed there is a controversy and there are radically different views. So sort of from the extreme sort of pro-life position, prohibiting everything, from, you might say, the extreme sort of pro-choice position where anything goes, okay? And how can I say? I think, I think where there is a recognition of the seriousness of this debate and things like that, there should be much more scope for certain kinds of conscientious objection, precisely because, the costs seem as though they're going to be high if you get it wrong, and very serious philosophers and things like that disagree on this, as do, large swathes of the population, as do different countries and things like that. There isn't really a settled view, but there is a settled view that something serious is at stake, it seems to be. Whether it's denial of right to choose, or whether it's, claims about aborting fetuses. But I think you're probably right that usually, yes, it's a rather sociological question where something is suppressed. You know, the way I would try to do it is coming back again to say, you know, that all of us have conscientious limits. Okay, so a friend of mine was at a talk with an abortionist in Oxford actually, and of course, you know, he was taking a fairly radical sort of pro-choice position, but then he himself said, well, I want conscientious objection rights because I don't want to do them after this point. I think that's wrong. So it seems that everybody is going to have these limits somewhere, and there are going to be certain things that they're going to take much more seriously than other things. Another way of trying to solve these problems to do with conscience is to look at the institution that we're talking about. So if you're talking about the institution of medicine, I would want to, or healthcare, I would want to ask some fundamental questions about what the nature of that institution is. What's the internal ethic of medicine, if you like? And if medicine has an internal ethic that makes sense of this practice, ought we to take certain conscientious objections that seem to be more in line with what might be the overall purpose of medicine, more seriously than ones that seem less related to the very purpose of that institution? So that might be one way in which you take. Similarly with wars, you know, what do we think about just war theory? What, you know, and do we take things seriously? And it's a general problem. The moral risk is a general problem. So, you know, abortion is obviously a very controversial case, but one can take a different case, like debates about vegetarianism, for example. So you might think it's fine to eat meat, and someone says it's absolutely wrong to eat meat. But you might sort of think, well, actually, you know, there is a risk that maybe animals feel a lot more pain than we had hitherto thought. There might be some recent discovery. And therefore, you know, might I have a reason to consider my meat-eating habits given that, you know, that there's a risk that I might be wrong? A lot of people will think, well, that's actually quite reasonable. But then maybe on the abortion debate, they have a much stronger ideological position, and so they're much less likely to think about the moral risk of getting it wrong. So it's a very ideological area, and I think the more ideological it is, the less you're likely to have, A, considerations of moral risk, because people think it's all settled, it's all about autonomy, or it's all about the sanctity of life, or whatever. Yes, I think you're less likely to get serious consideration of moral risk and leeway on conscientious objection than you are in an area maybe like, I don't know whether animal rights is a good example, but maybe one that's less, as it were, ideologically fierce than the abortion debate.
Just a final question.
I'm just going to make a brief observation, particularly with respect to the point that the gentleman a moment ago raised. In the example that you gave, the family position was one of uncertainty as to the outcome for them. We don't know how they react. Sure. They might react normally and probably would, in the sense of being saddened and grieved by it, and then move on with their lives. On the other side of the coin, considering the woman and the baby she doesn't want to abort, the only certain outcome for that side of the debate is the death of the baby. So you have a certain outcome if one decision is made. You have an uncertain and possibly neutral outcome, almost certainly neutral outcome, in the sense that the family will be sad and cope with it if the other decision is made. And I think when you say the family should be involved, I don't think that's necessarily weighing and giving equal or assessing weights objectively, because the weighting of evidence, if you consider the family, is one of uncertainty about outcome, but there's a certain outcome if you take the other option. So I just want to pose that as a way of thinking about it.
Well, one just example, this was a neonatologist in London who deals all the time with, these are babies that are born, but may die very soon afterwards, and viability, and some people make a decision to terminate before that happens, and some don't. And his observation was, and he deals with both sides as it were all the time, was that obviously there's terrible grief whatever happens, but he said that what was noticeable was that you get a very complicated kind of grief sometimes when a termination decision is made instead of the other one. Now, whether you put a great weight on that, whether that complicated grief is something to do more with when a termination is made, or a late term of a baby with fetal abnormality or some serious condition, as opposed to going to birth and then the baby dies. So there's
the science isn't great. There isn't a huge amount of research on it, but such as there is shows that the grief for the mother when they abort the baby is much greater and more complex than if they allow the baby be born and die naturally.
So that would gel with this idea that she may feel she's violated a negative prohibition, possibly, especially if there was pressure or something like that, and that would be a problem, as it were, in a way that the other one, it's a terrible thing either way, that might not be present there. And it may be that the family or the people surrounding it are only focused on a bad outcome, a baby or the burdens or the things, and less on what that might do to the person who's pressured, or the person who felt that they ought to do that. Okay, sorry about the downbeat nature of the topic, but thank you very much.
Thank you.